Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots Monday Morning, where we react to the Sunday morning news shows that we watch so that you don't have to. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Maté. Good Monday morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us. Please remember to like and share this stream. And also, don't forget to go to usefulidiotspodcast.com, which is our website where you can support the show and get bonus content.
And a like is so easy. It's effortless. And all you do is just give a thumbs up and you help the show and you help to spread the word and you help us debunk the propaganda that is so needed to be debunked. In fact, Aaron, I don't know if we're going to talk about this at all, but you at the Gray Zone, you and Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone have been fearless in responsibly questioning allegations of mass rape and sexual violence on October 7th. Electronic Intifada has also been questioning that. And it turns out that some people at the New York Times, the old gray lady, have been questioning that.
Are you saying that there's yet another atrocity propaganda story where I can do a touchdown dance and victory celebration because it's shown to be yet another scam?
I think perhaps.
I think so.
Perhaps.
Yes. This is in The Intercept. This came out, I believe, yesterday, that at the New York Times, which published this story by a journalist named Jeffrey Gettleman, alleging that Hamas used sexual violence as a tool of war on October 7th. At the New York Times, right now, there's a large amount of dissension within the ranks with people raising questions about Gettleman's story. Because, as we showed at the Gray Zone, and so did Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss, this story was a scam. It was an obvious scam. And it's such a scam that a dead Israeli woman who was used by the New York Times as like the symbol of rape by Hamas, her own family called out the Times for exploiting her death and saying that they never would have taken part in the story had they known they were going to try to, had they known the Times would try to suggest that she was raped, when they said there's no evidence of that whatsoever. And at the Gray Zone and at the Electronic Intifada, we showed how all the claims made just did not add up. They were not supported by the evidence. And now we learned from The Intercept that this is such a controversy internally that they were going to do a podcast about this on their show, The Daily, but they shelved it because people inside were not confident in Jeffrey Gettleman's reporting. So this should be a major media scandal. It should have been from the start. It shouldn't take The Intercept or the New York Times to validate what was obvious. And those few of us who were willing to point that out from the start are obviously vindicated, but it's not a surprise because the story was so flimsy.
Right. And of course, that's just a byproduct, a nice side piece, it's not the major. The major story is not the touchdown dance. The major story is well, for some of us it is. Yeah. But it's the important, and it's just how effective this atrocity propaganda is. And again, we talked about this with Craig McIver on this show. I talked about it with Norman Finkelstein, mostly actually with Muin Rabbani on my show. And I personally am not saying that I know for sure there wasn't any instances of sexual assault. We don't know. It could have happened, just like it could have happened during with what Israeli soldiers are doing to Palestinians. But it definitely, I will say, was not used. There's no evidence that it was used as a weapon on a mass scale.
I've never claimed that I'm God, so I can't vouch for every single action that happened everywhere. So anything is, of course, possible. The question is there evidence to support the allegations made by Israel that Hamas committed mass rape on October 7th? And there's zero to support that. And all the available evidence undermines it. And the goal of this allegation, just as the goal of now accusing UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency, of having some employees who were involved in October 7th, the goal of all of this is to distract people from the ongoing genocide before our eyes, and crucially, our government support for it. And that's why that explains the timing of these allegations, and that explains why the outlets like the Times rush to embrace them, because their function is not to educate people, not to do their jobs as journalists, it's to serve power. In this case, serve Israeli and U.S. power. And the Times put out this narrative about Hamas and sexual violence. Now the Times' own staffers are revolting against that because it's so transparently fraudulent. But they've already pivoted. So now the Times is now laundering Israel's latest claims about UNRWA, which we're going to talk about today.
Right.
And that's how it's a good illustration of how our media works.
And the damage is already done. This is what always happens. The damage is done. Just like with the 40 beheaded babies, the damage is done. Sure, they now have acknowledged that Biden lied 3 times, but it's still out there. And that's why this is so dangerous and why it's so important to debunk it in real time. And also, hopefully, if we had a robust media that was checking media lies or checking administration lies in the first place, we wouldn't have to be doing this. But we have to be doing this because we want to actually scare the media into not doing this.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, as a part of our as our scare-based approach to journalism, let's turn our sights to the Sunday news shows and kick it off with Meet the Press.
Good Sunday morning. Urgent talks are underway in the Middle East as American-led negotiators close in on a deal in which Israel would suspend its war in Gaza for about 2 months in exchange for the release of more than 100 hostages. That's according to the New York Times. CIA Director Bill Burns is in Paris today, meeting with Israeli, Egyptian, and Qatari officials. It comes as NBC News.
Look at that photo. Look at Biden's expression. Just awful. Sorry, everyone had to see that, and I had to pause on that.
He's closing his eyes. He's closing his eyes to visualize the genocide he's about to unleash with Netanyahu. It gives him a bear hug. He's like, "Oh yeah, I can't wait to kill all those Palestinian kids."
Right. I wonder if he just named how many were killed already. Yeah. And that's what's exciting him. Yeah. It's so gross.
Is reporting exclusively the Biden administration is discussing using weapons and ammunition sales to Israel as leverage to persuade the Israeli government to scale back its military assault on Gaza.
You don't say.
NBC.
You don't say.
Yeah.
What do you know? After at least 26,000 people killed, it's probably far higher, including
definitely higher.
13,000 children. Now, finally, we get word via one of the most reliable stenographers for the Biden administration, NBC News, that they're considering using their leverage and pausing weapons deliveries to Israel to get Israel to scale back its assault. I don't buy that for a second. I think it's just PR. And the timing is obvious. On Friday, the International Court of Justice ruled that there is a plausible case for genocide against Israel. It ordered Israel to allow in humanitarian aid and to stop killing Palestinians. And so, of course, now the Biden administration, being the accomplice to Israel, is going to come out with this face-saving leak saying, okay, now we're considering finally conditioning our aid, which, of course, I don't believe for a second.
But also, I thought, according to liberals, I heard 2 theories: that Biden had no control over Netanyahu, there was nothing he could do, or that he was already doing everything he could do.
That's true. That's true. Which is contradictory. It's like either you have no control, your hands are tied, or you're already doing all you can do, or you're already doing enough anyway. So which is it?
But it turns out he wasn't doing enough.
Yeah. What do you know?
What do you know? Yeah.
News. The U.S. is considering slowing or pausing the delivery of weapons, including artillery and precision-guided munitions, to pressure the Israelis to do more to protect Palestinian civilians. All of it the backdrop of a 2-front campaign with a...
This, by the way, is the same administration that not too long ago bypassed congressional review twice to expedite tank artillery and other weapons to Israel so they could destroy Palestinians in their homes. And now they want us to believe that now they're considering cutting some of that back. It's just such a fraud. And again, had the ICJ not ruled against Israel and its U.S. accomplice on Friday, I do not think we'd be seeing these attempted face-saving leaks.
Right. I also want to say one thing, which is that, remember, the ICJ ruled as much as it could have. It ruled that there was a plausible case for genocide, and that was their task at hand. They weren't supposed to rule on whether or not there was genocide. So this was a definite victory because they made as aggressive a ruling as they could have.
Yeah. And many people, including Ali Abunimah of the Electronic Intifada or Diana Boutou, who is a Palestinian lawyer, they argue that basically Israel can't implement the ICJ's order without effectively embracing a ceasefire. Right. And on that note, even the language of a ceasefire is like unfair because this is not a war between 2 equal sides. This is a mass murder campaign by one side against defenseless people in Gaza.
Right.
Defiant Nikki Haley vowing to stay in the race for the Republican nomination, despite losses in Iowa and New Hampshire. The next big battleground, Haley's home state of South Carolina, where overnight she sharpened her attacks against former President Trump.
Donald Trump was totally unhinged. Unhinged. He was a bit sensitive, and I think his feelings were hurt, but he threw a temper tantrum out on stage, seriously, threw a total temper tantrum, and was talking about revenge.
Now, South Carolina is still 27 days away, but Haley's refusal to drop.
Wow, Trump was talking about revenge. That's a first. Never heard him talk about revenge before. Yeah. I think she's referencing, though, when he recently said that Nikki Haley would be investigated if she won, but he wasn't even talking about himself doing that. He was talking about if she won, Democrats would try to investigate her because he was suggesting she has grounds to be investigated. I don't know why, but anyway, the point is Trump calling for revenge is kind of par for the course.
He also had some words. It is, yeah. And he was a vindictive guy when she accepted his position as ambassador to the UN.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah. But I think we're going to learn a little bit more about what she's talking about with his revenge plans.
Drop out, maybe getting under the former president's skin. He threatened this week anybody that makes a contribution to Haley, who he calls Bird Brain, from this moment forth will be permanently barred from the MAGA camp.
I'll tell you what, I feel sharper now than I did 20 years ago. Nikki Haley, have you ever heard of her? I didn't know she was still campaigning.
I mean, I think he's heard of her because he did name her ambassador to the UN.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point.
If she's such a nobody, then he's a loser for naming her.
It's so funny how many former Trump appointees have gone on to hate his guts. I mean, no president in history has such a roster of former principals who openly defy him, and in this case, campaign against him.
Yeah.
She's still campaigning? Oh, she was just endorsed by Liz Cheney. Can you believe it?
Adding to the political drama, President Biden has insisted the general election has already begun. It comes as he and lawmakers on Capitol Hill are grappling with a border deal that seems to be on life support. Last night in South Carolina, President Biden vowed again to shut down the border to secure emergency funding for Ukraine, as former President Trump promised to stand in the way of any deal.
Let's just take stock for a second of how the Ukraine proxy war is going. So Biden is so desperate now to prolong the war, at least until after the November 2024 election, that he's willing to go even to the right, if you can imagine this, the right of Trump's policies on the border. Remember, one of the Democrats' big campaign pitches when they ran against Trump was that they were going to be humane towards undocumented immigrants. But now Biden is in such a bad, perilous position with the Ukraine proxy war, after pushing Ukraine into a counteroffensive that U.S. officials knew would fail, that he's willing to sell out undocumented immigrants completely and accept all these worse than Trump policies on the border, basically shut down asylum and make it a lot more difficult for people to enter, just so he can get $60 billion to fund the war in Ukraine through 2024. That is the Biden strategy at this point. And it gets overlooked now because we're rightfully focused on the genocide in Gaza. But this is going on. And Republicans are, some want to play ball, obviously, because they're on a side about Ukraine. They're on a side when it comes to Ukraine, like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham. But others are not. And so it's creating a serious problem for Biden.
Right. Yeah, he was supposed to be better on lots of things, including treatment of immigrants and also Muslims, and not so great on his treatment of Muslims in Palestine.
Yeah,
or Muslim Americans who care about it. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole genocide thing against a majority Muslim population probably is not helping them with Muslim voters right now. But let's go back to Meet the Press.
If that bill were the law today, I'd shut down the border right now and fix it quickly. A bipartisan bill would be good for America and help fix our broken immigration system and allow speedy access for those who deserve to be here. And Congress needs to get it done.
Rather have no bill than a bad bill. A bad bill you can't have, and that's what was happening in the House.
I really hope the progressives who sided with Joe Biden to fund his Ukraine proxy war are drawing a lesson from this. because obviously progressives don't support these draconian immigration measures.
Right.
But Biden doesn't care about values. He doesn't care about progressive values. So all he cares about is his own political survival and U.S. hegemony. So therefore, he's now willing to sell out progressives and undocumented immigrants just so he can keep the Ukraine proxy war going. I hope it's a really teachable moment, I think, for all those progressives who convince themselves that giving Biden and the military-industrial complex and Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham $100 billion for a proxy war in Ukraine was the right thing to do.
Right.
Okay, well, one of those people who is allied with Joe Biden on Ukraine is Congressmember Mike McCall. He's the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And he, for one, is very happy with one of Biden's latest moves, which is one of the most sadistic things, I think, in U.S. history, which is no easy feat, which is cutting the funding of UNRWA, which is the UN agency serving Palestinian refugees. It's been operating for decades. It basically keeps millions of people alive. And it's always been in the crosshairs of Israel and its supporters because, so long as Palestinian refugees are cared for and have services, have jobs, have the minimum they need to survive, then they can stick around and they can't be ethnically cleansed, which is Israel's ultimate goal. So on the same day that the International Court of Justice ruled that there's a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide, the Biden administration and Israel immediately came out with these claims that a small group of staffers with UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency, were involved in October 7th. And the Biden administration and a bunch of vassal states, including Canada, Australia, and Britain, Germany, announced they are cutting funding to UNRWA. So amidst the genocide that the Biden administration is fueling, it's now cutting funding to the UN agency that keeps Palestinian refugees alive.
Yeah, by the way, I'm going to put a link, if that's okay, to my show with Craig. I made a clip of this in particular with Craig McIver, who is a former UN official. He's a human rights lawyer, because I asked him about this specifically. And he said that Israel has always hated UNRWA because it's a threat to Israel's ethno-nationalist plan. And he talked about what a disaster it is to cut funding to them. He also mentioned that the allegations of participation in October 7th. And of course, this could mean just people running through the gate. It doesn't mean that they even did anything. That in itself is a crime. So it could be as minor as that if it did happen. And those allegations were made through torture, because Shin Bet is the people who made that claim. So he says that those the evidence was elicited through torture. And even if there were 12 people, UNRWA is the biggest employer of in Palestine. They employ thousands and thousands and thousands of people, ranging from doctors to nurses to janitors to school teachers. And so you can fire those people, which they did before even investigating. You don't have to actually defund an entire program that's the lifeline for Palestinians.
There's a long article in the New York Times today laundering Israeli claims about UNRWA. And they talk about the so-called evidence that Israel has collected on these, on the small group of staffers. And they claim to have phone surveillance, that proves the role of these people in October 7th. What the Times does not mention, which is an incredible act of omission, it's very Orwellian. They don't mention what you said, Katie, which is that Israeli officials have admitted that the main source of their so-called evidence about these UNRWA staffers is interrogations, which means torture, because Israel practices torture. Right. So based on torture-derived so-called intelligence, just like the intelligence about Iraq WMDs was derived from torture, the U.S. is going to cut funding to an entire agency that employs 13,000 people and serves millions of refugees. It's such a joke. Meanwhile, they can so easily cut aid to Palestinian refugees while Israel's committing a genocide in front of our eyes. They won't withhold a single bullet. So it's just such a joke, and it's so cynical. It was so obviously timed because it coincided exactly with the ICJ ruling about Israel being likely complicit in genocide. And so everyone's playing along with it. It's so sick. And here's Congressmember Michael McCall, a Republican.
And one other thing is, do you think we could find 12 members of the IDF who've committed crimes?
Yeah.
If we do, if we find 12 IDF members who've committed crimes, let's just defund the IDF.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we should do.
I mean, that's why I said it's in terms of cynicism and cruelty. It's hard to find a parallel when I think about U.S. policies. And by the way, It's the Trump policy because Trump,
Right.
when he came in office, he cut funding for UNRWA
Right.
because he was under heavy pressure from his donors, including Sheldon Adelson, a fanatic Israel supporter, and also Nikki Haley, his now rival in the Republican nomination. Nikki Haley went to a Palestinian refugee camp, met with young Palestinian refugees, teenagers, who told her about their life experience. Nikki Haley came back to the U.S. and turned around and urged Trump to cut funding for these people.
Right.
I mean, it's just so evil. And now Biden, on one issue where he differentiated himself from Trump by restoring UNRWA funding, now he's cutting it, except the difference now is it's during a genocide. So here's Congressmember Michael McCaul, a Republican, defending Biden's decision.
Senate deal comes together, but it's DOA in the House, as we keep hearing. Will the House vote on some measure for Ukrainian aid that's not attached to the border? Or does
Let's start this at the right place.
Isn't that where it starts? At 3? Was that 3 minutes in? I think that is where it started.
This president could do the same thing, but he chooses not to.
Okay, quickly, if the Senate deal comes together, but it's DOA in the House, as we keep sure, as
And we don't.
there has long been a history of questions and problems about their activity. How do we get aid to people in the region who desperately need it, civilians, and also decide how we're going to hold this agency accountable?
Well, you do it through other NGOs like the World Food Program and others. I mean, the United Nations Relief Agency, the previous Trump administration cut all funding for a reason, just for this reason. The idea that UNRWA was actually supplying, harboring weapons to assist with Hamas's invasion of Israel. Now, those are the allegations that have come out of Israel. We're investigating.
Wait, sorry. Trump cut aid to UNRWA because of allegations that UNRWA was involved on October 7th. So Trump had a time machine, maybe.
Yeah,
To,
Aaron, he's even more brilliant than you thought, than you knew. Trump, yeah, he's all knowing.
But if true, think how outrageous that is.
If true, so you're acknowledging the allegations are not. You don't know if they're true or not. Yeah,
but might as well cut the whole thing. Why investigate? Just cut the whole thing if true.
And we do have reporting that UNRWA is using money to give aid to Hamas. And that's why I've advocated to cut that funding. The administration finally, after they allowed it, put a pause on it just a couple of days ago. And they're going to testify before my committee, and we're going to get some answers.
Okay, another foreign policy issue.
So this is how we get answers in the U.S. We get answers for the fact that there was a brief moment in time when we funded the Palestinian Refugee Agency, and that's what our opposition wants to have held to account. Not that we're committing genocide, not that we're supporting a genocide, not that we're now further immiserating Palestinian refugees. Michael McCaul wants answers for why that funding was briefly unpaused after Trump cut it.
That's the big scandal.
Yeah. I mean, truly true. I mean, we don't have the words to describe it.
Absolutely
Don't have the
sickening.
words to describe it.
And people are such dupes. And how can you blame them? Because you have the media like the New York Times doing Israel and the United States' bidding in the way that they cover this story.
Yes. And by the way, in that Times story, they admit the following quote: although the U.S. has yet to corroborate the Israeli claims itself, American officials say they found them credible enough to warrant suspending aid. So yes, we have no idea if these inconsequential allegations against a handful of people are even true, but let's go ahead and cut off funding for the entire agency and further punish millions of Palestinian refugees.
It's a good time to do it. It's a good time to err on the side of making Palestinians suffer more. Just absolutely repulsive. And as you said, sorry, what were you saying?
Just like there are no words for it. Like the word that comes to mind is sadism, but that doesn't capture it. It's beyond barbaric. It's just so deliberately cruel and evil. I mean, evil, I guess, is the best.
Yeah.
It's pure evil.
And it's totally working as a distraction, because I was actually speaking to a relative on Friday. When I did this special stream with Norman Finkelstein and Craig McIver on the ICJ response, I go, oh yeah, I'm doing a stream on they found that there's plausible case for genocide. And my relative goes, yeah, it's really getting terrible over there. It's terrible. And I thought she meant, the genocide. She's like, it's terrible. And it looks like that they were UN people were on Hamas's payroll. Really?
And listen, if you look at the New York Times homepage that day, and the front page the next day, the headlines were sort of given equal billing. The ICJ ruling against Israel was now equal with the UNRWA allegation, which serves to distract the public from the genocide going on. It's like it's a classic. It happens so often. It's such a sophisticated propaganda system because nobody in government is telling the New York Times or Fox News or CNN what to say. Everyone just internalizes the prevailing narrative, and they know that if they want to get access, that they want to get airtime, that they want to keep their jobs, they have to nod along and spread the lies, and they all do it.
Absolutely awful.
Okay, well, we have some more fun for you. Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, appeared on CNN. And Nancy Pelosi, like many other prominent Democrats, including genocide Joe Biden, has been facing protests for supporting the genocide, and which she's going to talk about in this clip. And rather than reflect on whether she wants to be supporting the mass murder of innocent people in Gaza, Nancy Pelosi could only see one thing lurking behind all these protests. And everyone could probably guess what that is. It's one man whose name is Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges that Democrats might have in organizing is some anger in some corners of the progressive movement over Joe Biden's support for Israel in its war against Hamas terrorists.
It's not a war against Hamas terrorists. It's a genocide against Palestinian civilians.
Right. How could you ever call it that when the ratio of Hamas people to civilians killed is so incredibly low? And when, as we exposed last week, they're only now starting to focus on higher value targets. They've had until now to be focusing on wholesale slaughter.
That's right. The Deputy National Security Advisor, John Feiner, admitted that last week, and we featured that clip on Monday morning.
How concerned are you, especially given the fact that we have seen protesters over and over and over at his events? How concerned are you that people...
Look at how concerned Dana Bash is about the protest. Like, we've seen the protests over and over.
I know.
And over.
It's horrible.
People just can't stop calling for an end to genocide over and over and over. She's exhausted. She's troubled.
Yeah. She's troubled, yeah.
Horrible sight of people with a conscience standing up. Oh.
She should have offered a trigger warning, honestly, before showing this clip of this woman here. Yeah.
Arab Americans, progressives. I'm not suggesting that they're going to go vote for Donald Trump, but how concerned are you that they might just stay home?
Well, let me just say this, because I've been
Notice how she says she almost calls herself a victim.
Yes.
And then she realizes that would be too bad, too embarrassing of a thing to say, so she fixes it.
Well,
I'm the victim of people opposing my support for genocide. Yes.
Recipient of their, shall we say, exuberances in this regard, as recently as in Seattle on Thursday, unfortunately, wanted to disrupt our very exciting Democratic meeting there. They're in front of my house all the time. So I have a feeling for what feelings they have. But we have to think about what we're doing. And what we have to do is try to stop the suffering in Gaza. This is women and children, people who don't have a place to go. So let's address that. But for them to call...
How are you addressing it?
Yeah, Nancy.
How are you addressing it? How are you doing that? What are you doing? All we've gotten from the Biden administration is saying we're having tough conversations with Israel.
Right.
We're having hard conversations that we're not privy to and that are accompanied by zero demands and zero leveraging of the critical U.S. support for Israel. So how exactly does Pelosi want to address the suffering that she claims she's against?
She'll get to that. It's not, in due time, Aaron. Stop being so impatient.
So let's address that. But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see.
All roads lead to Putin. All
true.
roads lead to Putin.
Yes. I was totally supportive of Israel until I heard Putin say something critical about it. And then I was like, oh, wow, I guess it's time to call for a ceasefire.
Did Putin offer you any money to say that, Katie? Because that's what Nancy Pelosi is going to suggest.
I can't.
Next.
Well, obviously, if he had done that, I wouldn't be able to say it, or else or else Putin would do to me what the U.S. is doing to UNRWA.
All right. Well, if you are opposing genocide because Putin paid you to do so, then Nancy Pelosi.
Blink twice.
Yes. Well, also she's on your trail.
Oh yeah. Don't worry, guys. Yeah.
Same thing with Ukraine. It's about Putin's message. I think some of these some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere.
Wow.
Some I think are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now. As
You think some of these protests are Russian?
Let's hear that
What have you
again.
looked
It's
at?
such an insane statement. Let's
And
hear
what
that
have you
again.
looked at, Nance?
Message. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some I think are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now. As
You think some of these protests are Russian plants?
I think they're plants. I think some financing should be investigated. And I want to ask the FBI to investigate that. But
So there we go, everybody.
Thank
If
you, Nancy.
you are out there opposing Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden for supporting a genocide in Israel, enforcing a genocide in Israel, enabling a genocide in Israel, you might be being paid by Vladimir Putin himself, and you're just parroting Putin's message. As Nancy Pelosi said during the height of Russia mania when Trump was in office, all roads lead to Putin.
Right.
And really, this is the direct outgrowth of Russiagate, and why shows like this and a few other voices, unfortunately far too many, were so opposed to Russiagate from the start, because this was always about demonizing anybody who dissents from the DNC establishment and their neocon foreign policy, and smearing them as Russian agents, and basically blaming everything on Vladimir Putin rather than their own failures and their own dysfunctions. And so this is the logical endgame of where Russiagate would go. Now having the gall to say that people who oppose a genocide are being paid by Vladimir Putin.
Absolutely despicable. I mean, but she's looked at this for a long time, Aaron.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
she mentions the FBI and intelligence. This is the Russiagate playbook. Adam
Right.
Schiff used to go on these shows and say, I can't tell you, but the intelligence that I've seen, but I can tell you that there's more than circumstantial evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. So all of that was a scam, and it feeds into scams like this. And when there's no accountability for pushing a lie on the U.S. public
Right.
for years and years and years, the purveyors of that lie will be emboldened to keep lying. And they'll be emboldened to keep using their fear tactics against anybody who opposes them. So now it's such a farce that they're willing to dust off the Russiagate playbook and use it against people who are protesting them for supporting a genocide.
Well, Hillary wanted to see Donald Trump and Putin's phone records, remember, for January 6th.
Of course, everything is Putin's fault. But look, I saw...
And October 7th was Putin's birthday, right?
That's right. That's Nikki Haley. That's right. Yes. But, I saw some progressives online yesterday, some, progressives more aligned with the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, complaining about how offensive it was that Nancy Pelosi said this. It was offensive, and I'm glad they called it out. But where were they when the same playbook was being used to smear everybody else? It was used to smear Trump and his supporters. Criticize them all you want, but rather than take on Trump on his actual policies, the tactic was to accuse him of being a Russian agent.
Yeah.
And a lot of progressives played into that because they thought in their brains that they were actually challenging Trump. What they actually were doing was playing into a scam that now has been repackaged to be used against them. So this is a really teachable moment, I think. And let's talk about the irony for a second of Nancy Pelosi accusing people who oppose a genocide committed by Israel of being financed by a foreign power. Nancy Pelosi is one of dozens of Democratic and Republican lawmakers who receive a lot of money from foreign lobby groups that back Israel. We never hear any scrutiny of that. We never hear any calls for FBI investigations of that. And here, for example, is a clip of Nancy Pelosi appearing with Democratic mega donor Haim Saban, a huge supporter of Israel. And listen to what she said about Israel's role in the U.S.
I have said to people when they ask me if this Capitol crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment to our aid. I don't even call it aid, our cooperation with Israel. That's fundamental.
Unbelievable. Just saying the quiet part out loud.
So that's how in the pocket Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who's sitting next to her, and all these other politicians are to the Israel lobby, that even if the Capitol were to crumble, the one thing that would remain is their commitment to Israel, which now includes commitment to supporting Israel's genocide. And we have a clip to play from two activists who were involved in the protests against Biden this weekend in South Carolina. He gave events and he was interrupted by members of groups including Jewish Voice for Peace, calling them out for the genocide. So they sent us this video responding to Nancy Pelosi's comment on CNN.
Hi, I'm Josh.
I'm Alex.
We're JVP members organizing with Advocacy and Justice Alliance in South Carolina this past weekend actions to bring attention to the genocide currently unfolding in Gaza.
We wanted to respond to Nancy Pelosi's comments on disruptors being paid by Putin. We're absolutely not getting paid for this work, and it's telling on how out of touch the DNC leadership is, that they can't even comprehend political action that comes from a place of actual moral conviction, rather than something that you only do when you get paid.
Nancy Pelosi herself has taken more than $600,000 from pro-Israel lobbies over the years, and someone should look into the effect of all that money on her policy choices.
Amen. And thank you, guys, for sending us that. And thanks for all the work you're doing. And yeah, it's exactly right. Let's have an FBI investigation of how pro-Israel money is corrupting Congress. That's actual foreign influence, not this fictional belief from Pelosi that Putin is paying people to oppose the Israeli genocide.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's almost helpful that they say this stuff out loud, because it just shows how out of touch, dishonest. I don't know. I'm always curious if they actually believe this or not. Like, if they are lying to themselves, if they really think that's true.
Pelosi looks like she actually believes it.
So sad.
Yeah. But again, when you're in a cult, which is Russiagate, it's very easy to be indoctrinated into believe in cult orthodoxy. And a fundamental belief of the Russiagate cult is that Putin is all powerful, he controls everything, and anyone who inconveniences the Democratic Party establishment must be in the pocket of Putin. Even Bernie Sanders has fallen to prey to that, even though Russiagate was used against Bernie Sanders, because of course in the 2020 primary, when Sanders was running against Biden, what did they do on the eve of the Nevada caucus? They claimed that now Putin was trying to help Bernie. And Bernie, rather than calling that out as a scam, kind of accepted it. His campaign at least accepted it. They didn't forcefully challenge it. And that was another own goal by Bernie and his aides.
Right.
Okay, let's move on.
This is a good one. No, one of our faves, Martha Raddatz. She's so war thirsty. This is a great clip. Let's take a look at what Martha Raddatz this week has to say while she's talking to Joint Chief of Staff Chairman C.Q. Brown.
Sworn in just 1 week before the horrific Hamas terrorist.
It's 46 seconds.
Missile launchers. It doesn't seem to be deterring the militants.
Well, part of our work here is to make sure as things have happened in the Middle East, is not to have the conflict broaden.
She's talking about the Houthis, that it's not deterring them, right?
And so as I provide advice and we think about the approach we take, we want to ensure that we take away capability while we protect our forces, at the same time not have this broaden into a much wider conflict.
When you walk this fine line of not wanting it to escalate, what would you say to those people who are your critics who would say, look, they're not being tough enough on these militants. They're not being tough enough on Iran.
I would also
not being tough enough on Iran. Yeah.
What would you say to those critics, including, say, a journalist at ABC News sitting right in front of you who wants war with Iran? Yeah. What would you say?
Yeah. It's funny. She's not like, what do you say to your critics who say that this is not working and costing lives, both American lives and lives of Yemenis, not to mention Palestinians? You never hear her asking anyone to speak to those critics.
And I'm going to rewind this a little bit because I accidentally cut it off. So we're going to hear just the end of that question again.
Oh, it's a great one.
Enough on these militants.
Oh, sorry.
Who are your critics who would say, look, they're not being tough enough on these militants. They're not being tough enough on Iran.
I would also ask, do they want a broader conflict? Do you want us in a full-scale war? And
I think we know the answer for Martha. The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
That's the goal, is to deter them, and we don't want to go down a path of greater escalation that drives to a much broader conflict within the region.
When you look at the Houthis right now, how much of their capabilities do you think you have reduced?
I know we've had an impact. I won't characterize how much, but we have had an impact on their capabilities.
The Iraqis.
How about you say, given that they are doing this to protest the genocide and to block the genocide of Palestinians, have you considered stopping the genocide? Why don't you ask that instead of how much they've damaged their capabilities?
Not an option. Not an option.
Okay,
Genocide first.
Here's another great question. She's got such great questions.
But we have had an impact on their capabilities.
The Iraqis have suggested that the presence of U.S. forces, after there was a retaliatory strike there, should be reassessed or maybe leave. Do you see in the future us reducing our forces or having the American forces leave Iraq?
Well, what I'll tell you is we're in Iraq by the invitation of the government of Iraq. And I will also tell you that we will defend ourselves.
Do you see us leaving?
Just one correction. At the invitation of the government of Iraq. Yes, the government of Iraq that was basically installed by the U.S. after the U.S. overthrew the government of Iraq in 2003. And also, even this government of Iraq, which is, you can say, a client of the U.S., but they're in a tough position because they also have close ties to Iran. So they kind of try to straddle both. In 2020, this government of Iraq voted to expel U.S. troops.
Right.
And after they killed Qasem Soleimani, after the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani. And how did the Trump administration respond? They responded by threatening to seize Iraq's foreign reserves, which are held in a New York bank, if Iraq followed through with that demand. So that forced Iraq to back down. So yes, Iraq officially has asked the U.S. to remain, but they've given mixed signals, including asking the U.S. wants to leave and being told to shut up by the U.S.
Yeah. Well, wait, we got a really good final question from Martha.
Is that what Iran would want?
I will also tell you that we will defend ourselves.
Do you see us leaving? Is that what Iran would want?
Well, I think that's what Iran would want.
Do you think?
What a wonderful setup.
Yeah.
For him.
Yeah. How about would maybe the families of the U.S. soldiers want their loved ones returned home rather than enforcing U.S. hegemony? Can we maybe take them into consideration? Does everything have to be about what Iran wants? And so what if Iran wants us to leave? Does that mean we can't do it? Are we just reflexively? Is this a thing? Whatever Iran doesn't want, we have to do the opposite?
Yeah, exactly. Iran doesn't want the world to end, so maybe we should end the world.
Exactly. Iran doesn't want Armageddon. Too bad. Too bad, Iran.
Too bad. We can't let them get their way.
But you notice there was that moment where he had to remind Martha Raddatz, we're trying to avoid a war, right?
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. Now she didn't quite get that. This is now the second straight chair of the Joint Chiefs who is less hawkish than most of the U.S. political establishment and the U.S. media, because his predecessor, Mark Milley, famously called for diplomacy with Russia back in November 2022 to end the Ukraine proxy war. But he was basically told to shut up by the Biden administration and the U.S. media because diplomacy, no, we don't do that. So, and now, just the fact that Chairman Brown here says that, we don't want a war with Iran, that's an example of a military chief, again, being less hawkish
than the media.
Yeah.
Always a good sign.
Okay. How about we skip clip 5 for now? We'll come back to it if we have time, but we only have limited time, so I want to keep rushing. So let's go to Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is among those who has been calling for a ceasefire since very early on and critical of Biden on Gaza. But she went on Meet the Press and was asked a very simple question. Do you agree with all the progressives who have been protesting Biden that he's supporting a genocide? And watch how AOC responded.
Some of your colleagues, and we talked about what's happened at the protests this week, have called the president Genocide Joe. Some of your colleagues have accused the president of supporting genocide, including Rashida Tlaib. Do you agree with that word, genocide, that the president's been supporting a genocide, or does that go too far?
I think what we are seeing right now throughout the country is that young people are appalled at the violence and the indiscriminate loss of life. We are not just seeing 25,000 people that have died in Gaza. We are seeing the starvation of millions of people, the displacement of over 2 million Gazans. We have South Africa that has mounted a court in the ICJ. The ICJ ruled this week that Israel has a grave responsibility to prevent genocide.
But they're still
fact
determining whether it's a genocide. Do you think that
they are
term
still
is responsible,
determining
given
it?
that it's still under investigation?
Okay, before we get to Pelosi's thing, that is such a stupid way to set it up. Welker either doesn't understand or is intentionally lying, because the way she's making it sound is that they haven't determined it yet, so let's not call it a genocide. The truth is they weighed that the case which was presented, which is there a plausible case for genocide? They said, yes, there is. And that was based on the evidence of genocide. Now, the next thing they do is they go and they do a long investigation that takes years. And the reason that South Africa did the plausibility test as opposed to genocide is because things like this take years to investigate. So yes, it's responsible for calling it that. And if Welker had watched the proceeding, she would have seen all the reading of evidence, including the judges reading into evidence the way that the Palestinians have suffered, including the genocidal statements made by Israeli officials. So she's an idiot, Welker here, and making it seem like it's irresponsible to use the word genocide when it's actually responsible to use it.
I imagine she might be taking her cues from White House spokesperson John Kirby, who immediately after the ICJ hearing, he said that the ICJ had found Israel not guilty of genocide, which is just insane. Like they actually said there's a plausible case for it, and that's why it can proceed.
Right.
It's like basically it's like having like a preliminary hearing and the judge saying, yes, this case can go forward.
Exactly.
Because the judge doesn't issue a guilty verdict. That's like the defendant saying, okay, yeah, see, I'm not guilty.
Right,
even though I'm about to go to court and be charged with this.
It's a perfect analogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear her response.
I believe that they're still determining it, but in the interim ruling, the fact that they said there's a responsibility to prevent it, the fact that this word is even in play, the fact that this word is even in our discourse, I think demonstrates the mass inhumanity that Gazans are facing. And so whether you are an individual that believes this is a genocide, which, by the way, in our polling, we are seeing large amounts of Americans concerned specifically with that word. So I don't think that it is something to completely toss someone out of our public discourse for using. But I think what we are seeing here is that the Netanyahu government has lost public support and that we have a responsibility to protect the human rights and the humanity of Gazans and hostages alike in the area.
All right. So, I understand that AOC thinks she's mounting a defense of anti-genocide protesters and Rashida Tlaib, but she was asked a very simple question: Do you agree?
Yeah.
Do you agree whether this is genocide? And she didn't answer it. And I think that's because she's afraid of the political cost of standing up and saying, yes, this is a genocide. But how can you look at Israel's extermination campaign? Vast majority of victims are innocent civilians. Israel's cutting off all aid. They've made openly genocidal statements. There's a preponderance of evidence. How can you not say that this is a genocide? And I just think that's really weak and a real moral failing on her part.
Yeah, it was pretty easy to just say yes or no.
And before I forget, one point I wanted to make about UNRWA, I can't remember if we said it or not, the allegations against the Palestinian Refugee Agency, even if all the allegations against these employees are true, it wouldn't possibly justify cutting off a single piece of aid to UNRWA, let alone, tens of millions of dollars. I just think it's like the problem is like when Israel and its allies make these allegations, we get into these debates about whether it's true or not, but then we lose sight of the underlying premise that the whole thing is a farce to begin with. And if Israel weren't military occupying Gaza and the West Bank with U.S. support, there wouldn't be a need for a Palestinian Refugee Agency to begin with. And that's what has to be addressed, not whether a couple of employees took part in October 7th.
Right. Just absolutely disgusting.
Okay, we have more from AOC. Speaking about the nominees, the nomination battle inside her own party, she's already, as we covered on Useful Idiots, she's already endorsed Joe Biden, urged everybody to be grown adults, right? And suggested that anyone who's like not willing to vote for Biden is just mad on the internet.
Right.
And so here she is talking about the current Democratic field.
Think Do you think President Biden is the strongest person to take on former President Trump, given everything you've just said, Congresswoman?
I think what we have right now, what we've seen in New Hampshire, he is virtually the nominee of the party. His turnout in New Hampshire is actually not something to ignore. We saw from a write-in campaign, remember, President Biden wasn't even on the ballot in New Hampshire. He won overwhelmingly with turnout that even exceeded Obama 2012 turnout when Obama was on the ballot. And so there are quite a few indicators in his strength in New Hampshire. We will see what happens in South Carolina and, of course, when we get to important primaries like Michigan.
So, and just to be clear, though, do you think the president's the strongest person to take on Mr. Trump if he is the nominee? It's still an if.
Yes. And I mean, especially when we look at this field, we have, Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson. President Biden, I think without question, among that field is the strongest nominee.
I mean, she was supposed to be like a radical insurgent inside the Democratic Party, pushing progressive policies. And now, once again, falling in line behind Genocide Joe. And, no wonder she doesn't want to call what Joe Biden is backing a genocide, because she wants people to vote for him. And if you admit that Joe Biden's backing a genocide, it's pretty hard to make the case that people should go and vote for him on election day.
Or that you should be stumping for him, basically, effectively, which is what she's doing.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, meanwhile, I wouldn't write off Dean Phillips or Marianne Williamson. I mean, we wrote off Dean Phillips, and we had that on our face for that. But,
she didn't even meet with. I mean, Marianne Williamson tweeted out she didn't even meet with her, and it's true. Marianne Williamson said this. I think this is true, that her policies are probably closer to AOC's than Biden's are.
Absolutely, of course. Biden has said he would veto Medicare for all.
Right.
Like, put aside the whole genocide thing if you don't care about that much. On every issue, Biden is a neoliberal. He always has been.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're willing to get behind him so early, especially, it's, look.
And Williamson is calling for a ceasefire now. Like, why wouldn't you at least use this as leverage to pressure Joe to call for a ceasefire?
Absolutely. That's one way Joe Biden's policies could possibly be influenced.
Yeah.
Members of his own party were willing to challenge him and say, if you want our support, you have to, for example, embrace a ceasefire. But that's been the progressive playbook, and for a long time, just basically falling in line, never using their leverage to get anything. And here we are.
Yep.
Okay. Well,
and also, isn't she embarrassed that there were no debates? I guess not.
No. Okay, let's turn to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, because one of the areas where progressives have fallen in line behind Joe Biden is giving him more than $100 billion to support his proxy war in Ukraine. And even though Biden has been caught sabotaging multiple diplomatic opportunities to both avoid the war before Russia invaded and end the war shortly after it began. Well, now Biden's in a bind because the war is going badly. He wants another $60 billion, but Republicans in Congress are blocking that. So here is Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, in Washington to help lobby holdout Republicans. He's the guy who famously said that weapons are the way to peace in Ukraine. He also admitted very helpfully and very accurately that the war did not start in February 2022 when Russia invaded. It started back in February 2014 after a U.S.-backed Maidan coup. Stoltenberg said that that's when the war began. He's right about that. So here he is now making the case for why American taxpayers should cough up another $60 billion to keep the proxy war going.
And obviously, as you know, you've heard throughout our show, Ukraine, the funding for it here from the U.S. is tied up with a big dispute over our border and other political issues. You're going to meet with a lot of top defense officials and with lawmakers on the Hill this week. What will your message be to them about Ukraine funding from the U.S.?
So first of all, I understand that the border issue is important. That's important in the United States, as it is in many other NATO allies. But it's not for NATO to give advice on exactly how different allies are dealing with border issues. What matters is that Ukraine gets continued support because we need to realize that this is closely watched in Beijing. So it's not only making Europe more vulnerable, but all of us, also the United States, more vulnerable if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine. And this is actually a good deal because we, by using a fraction of the US defense budget, we have been able to destroy and degrade the Russian army substantially. And therefore we should continue to do so, because not least knowing that most of this money is actually spent in the United States. We buy US weapons to support Ukraine. This secures jobs in America and makes us all safer.
There's been some growing
jobs in
It's
America.
a great deal.
Guys.
It's a great deal. Everybody,
Yeah.
jobs in America. I thought this whole thing was about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and also defending the principle of democracy versus autocracy. I didn't realize that it's actually a great deal because we get to degrade Russia's military.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
right.
even though we're sacrificing tens of thousands of Ukrainians, I guess I'm supposed to believe it's worth the trade-off because we also sacrifice Russians too. And also we create American jobs. So like, what's not to love?
And we're sending a good message to China.
There we go.
It is true how much it's so much more about, even when it's about Russia versus Ukraine, as opposed to being about China or about American jobs or whatever. Even when it's Russia versus Ukraine, it's so much more about inflicting harm on Russia than it is helping Ukraine.
Yes. And what's amazing is, people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, they all talk about the military industrial complex, right? And how we need to actually invest in jobs at home for good, like building things, not weapons of war, right? Building infrastructure, spending on social programs. Then they turn around and hear people like Jens Stoltenberg begging for more money so they can degrade Russia and create jobs for American workers in the weapons industry. And they still don't think, geez, maybe maybe my votes to authorize more than $100 billion for this Ukraine proxy war, maybe it's not really in line with my progressive values, given that the people I'm in bed with are openly saying it's to like serve the military industrial complex and kill Russians. It doesn't give anybody pause. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And right now the only people who are leading an opposition at all to this are Republicans in Congress. Like, when are the progressives going to wake up? I don't know. It's pretty striking.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we go to, which one should we do next?
Let's go to Senator Tim Kaine.
Right.
Remember him?
Oh yeah, Hillary's Veep.
Hillary's Veep nominee. What's his name? The playwright of Hamilton. I'm blanking on his name.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Lin-Manuel had that wonderful classic song, Tim Kaine and the Membrane.
Oh, I think I blocked that out.
Yeah, sorry to bring that back. He actually is voicing some skepticism of Joe Biden's policy of just bombing Yemen without any congressional authorization. So here he is discussing that on Face the Nation.
President Biden has talked about these U.S. strikes on the Houthis continuing. I know you have some issue with that.
I do, Margaret. Not with the notion that we have to protect our own ships, naval or commercial, from the Houthis, and even strategically protect the Red Sea from the Houthis. But there's no congressional authorization for a war in Yemen or the Red Sea against the Houthis, none. The president has asserted that these strikes are about self-defense and they're designed to deter the Houthis, but the administration has also said that they believe that the attacks are going to continue and even escalate. As you know, I'm from Virginia. We have a lot of people in harm's way in the Red Sea and the Middle East right now on this mission. And what they want to know is, what's the strategy? What's the plan for de-escalation? If the U.S. is going against the Houthis to protect shipping of other nations, what are other nations doing as part of this mission? That's why a bipartisan group of senators, we wrote the president this week and said, what is the strategy? How will we de-escalate? And what is the legal rationale that you are using when Congress hasn't authorized this military action? And this week, we're going to be digging heavily into those questions.
Jesus Christ. And of course, as we know, because Biden himself has said this will not deter the Houthis, but it's going to keep going.
Yes. And, Tim Kaine's call for congressional oversight is especially now relevant because of what happened shortly after the Sunday morning news shows, which is that in the region of the Jordan-Syria border, for the first time since October 7th, U.S. forces were killed. 3 U.S. forces were killed, and I believe 35 were injured, including some critically, in a drone strike on a U.S. military base in the Jordan-Syria region. Now, interestingly, the U.S. says that the U.S. forces were killed in Jordan, but Jordan says that's false, that they're actually killed on the Syrian side of the border. And one reason why the Biden administration might be lying here is because they don't like to call attention to the fact that they have an illegal military base in Syria. In Jordan, they have the cooperation of the Jordan government because Jordan's a client state of the U.S. Syria does not want the U.S. there, but the U.S. operates there anyway because the U.S. wants to steal Syria's oil and wheat to keep Syria poor because Syria resisted a U.S.-backed dirty war for more than a decade. And we played the clips before of U.S. officials basically admitting that. So now, because Biden's so committed to enforcing U.S. hegemony, to punishing Syria for resisting a U.S.-backed dirty war, and of course, he's so committed to enforcing the genocide of Gaza, now he has caused the deaths of U.S. soldiers who have faced strikes. Before October 7th, there was about a 6-month undeclared truce between Iran's allies in the region and the U.S. There were no attacks on U.S. forces in the region before October 7th. October 7th changed everything because now, of course, people in the region don't want to see a genocide. And so they're resisting in the ways they can. And so because Biden's so committed to this genocide, now he's sacrificed the lives of 3 U.S. troops. And the question is, what next? He's already vowing to retaliate. So we could see an even bigger escalation by Genocide Joe's administration.
I thought this was the guy who was like not reckless and the guy who knew how to work with the opposition and knew what he was doing, was a creature of the Senate and respected norms.
He respects the norms of U.S. hegemony, and he respects them way too much because that's all it's always committed to. It's all he can see, even if it's costing him his election chances. People are protesting him. He's seeing the declining numbers. It doesn't matter. This guy's a committed hegemon. He's been that way his whole career. He loves Israel. He's, some Israeli leaders have voiced alarm at how fanatic he is in supporting their aggression. Even for Menachem Begin, a former Israeli prime minister, there's a story about him being taken aback by what a fanatic Biden was when it comes to killing women and children. And so all this is just a continuation of that commitment by Joe Biden. And now he's cost the lives of at least 3 U.S. soldiers and possibly far more as he weighs a new escalation.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I think we can leave it there.
Yeah.
And save the rest for our Thursday Throwdown.
Sure.
Which you can subscribe to at usefulidiots.podcast.com.
Make sure you check out the interview from this week. It's really fascinating and really important. We interviewed 2 people. We had on Asa Winstanley, who talks about the role that Israel played in killing its own on October 7th, and based on Israeli journalists' accounts. And then an interview with Maoz Inan, who is a peace activist whose parents were killed on October 7th. And even he realizes that what Netanyahu is doing is terrible.
2 very powerful interviews, 2 very different perspectives, but
very different perspectives, yeah.
But very, very powerful. And Katie, anything you want to plug for the Katie Halper Show this week?
I'll be talking to a doctor who does a lot of work in Palestine, and I'll also be talking to one of the students who was sprayed with skunk water on Columbia's campus. I don't know if you guys heard about that story, but pro-Palestinian students had to be hospitalized because they were sprayed with skunk water by pro-Israel protesters at Columbia's University.
Including an Israeli soldier or a former Israeli soldier.
Yeah, former Israeli soldier, yeah. So we're going to be talking about that, yeah.
So we've been forced to hear this nonstop complaint about how unsafe pro-Israel students feel on campus. Meanwhile, anti-genocide students and protesters get attacked with skunk water, causing injuries and serious harm. And sorry, their safety doesn't matter. Yeah. And if you guys haven't seen it, Katie, you'll put a link to it in the description. Katie did an interview on Friday with Craig McIver and Norman Finkelstein responding to the ICJ ruling. I highly recommend that to really inform voices weighing in on that momentous decision. So check that out.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. See you later this week and then next week on Monday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.